Zack Snyder is a great director, full stop, no qualifications. He has a good eye for detail, a strong sense of scene geography, a genuine skill for framing and grasp of visual as narrative that far exceeds many of his better regarded peers, particularly those who tend to attach themselves to more attainable, less risky projects. Let's be very clear about that last part, because it's something that gets lost in the consideration of many modern filmmakers' work, because we've become overly inured to the idea of mainstream Hollywood genre film as being an inherently risk-proof venture. Whatever you may think of the individual films themselves, Zack Snyder's directorial filmography is entirely comprised of projects that were significant financial and creative risks, not just in terms of the way he opted to make them, but in the DNA of each film's conception. Even more impressively, the most consistent risk among them is to his own artistic reputation. He would appear, from the perspective of a neutral observer, to have deliberately sought out movie projects where, even if the finished film were to be successful, he would almost certainly become villainized, target of ridicule for a not insignificant portion of the audience. He made his debut directing a remake of Dawn of the Dead, one of the most well-established classics of the horror genre, whose mere prospect of being remade was guaranteed to draw the ire of passionate fans, a seeming no-win situation if ever there was one. 300 openly antagonized not only political commentators thanks to its faithful translation of Frank Miller's deeply uncomfortable obsession with dehumanizing historic Middle Eastern characters while simultaneously valorizing icons of Western patriarchy through celebratory quasi-fascist neoclassical military myth-making, it also practically invited historians to draw their knives on Miller's preposterous revisionism. Watchmen was considered not only unfilmable on a practical level, but to many fans something that it would be sacrilege to even attempt. There's probably no universe where the owls of Ga'Hoole ever look like a sure bet, and of course, whatever you think of the result, Sucker Punch is one of the most audacious and recognizably personal films a director of his caliber has ever convinced a major studio to release at that point in his career. A densely layered film of ideas and meditations that aims all at once to be an exploration of cinematic language, a manifesto on visual and thematic representations of gender, sexuality, and the feminine form in contemporary genre film, a deconstruction and celebration of genre differentiation, a representational argument between generational schools of post-1960s feminist theory, and a repository for a succession of unmistakably specific visual tableaus that had clearly been scrambling to break free from the director's fertile imagination for years. I say again for clarity, irrespective of your opinion on the film itself, alone puts a lie to the idea of Snyder as some kind of hack. Regardless of execution, hacks do not make that kind of personal, introspective work, and certainly don't lay themselves out on the altar to be lashed at over it. That's what makes them hacks.
Remember, ladies, if you don't stand for something, you'll fall for anything.
Even his transition to, for a little while anyway, overseer of the so-called DC Extended Universe was a profound risk, particularly to his own clout and credibility, which, as we've just discussed, he also cashed in the bulk of once before. Filmmakers have been trying for over 3 decades to pull Superman out from under the shadow of Christopher Reeve and Richard Donner, and everyone who's tried has not only been widely judged a failure, but seen their career suffer a setback because of it. The only thing more guaranteed to be a thankless job poorly received was to be the first filmmaker to try their hand at Batman after Christopher Nolan had finished with the property. And not only did Snyder sign on to do both, he attached his subsequent fortunes, in multiple senses of the word, to a fast-track Justice League movie that even under the best circumstances was almost certainly destined, fairly or not, to be received as an also-ran in comparison to the defining blockbuster of this decade, aka The Avengers. Suffice to say, Zack Snyder is not a bad filmmaker, even if this particular case he happens to have been one of the parties most responsible for an extremely bad film. But since his work on that extremely bad film is about to be highlighted in very explicit detail, I figured it was incumbent to mention that up front, where it wouldn't be drowned out amid the overwhelmingly more negative stuff. Because here's the thing about Watchmen. It's satirical, but unlike other dressing downs of the genre like Kick-Ass, Howard the Duck, or even The Dark Knight Returns in its own way, Watchmen isn't really funny. It's a straight-up tragedy with very little in the way of farce. It's also a lot more specific in its targeting than most people realize. While the finished product indeed attempts to cast its blanket of condemnation on the whole of the superhero comics landscape, Alan Moore originally started out with the intent of deconstructing a very specific corner of it. In 1983, DC Comics had purchased the right to a stable of moderately well-known Silver Age superheroes belonging to the defunct Charlton Comics publishing operation. Most notably, a set of characters created and or co-created by one-time Spider-Man co-creator Steve Ditko, The Question, Captain Atom, Nightshade, and the second incarnation of Blue Beetle, along with Blue Beetle number 1, Thunderbolt, and Peacemaker, who'd been created by other people. Moore, working then directly at DC, conceived a story that would have used these Charlton heroes as the players in a pitch-dark, epic-scale deconstruction of the entire superhero genre, similar to themes he'd previously explored in his revival of Marvel Man, aka Miracle Man, back in the UK. DC wanted the book, but they also wanted to still eventually integrate the Charlton heroes into the mainstream DC universe, so Moore renamed and further redesigned his already satirically reimagined versions into Rorschach, Dr. Manhattan, Silk Spectre, Night Owl, Ozymandias, and the Comedian, ultimately creating Watchmen.
My new world demands less obvious heroism. Your schoolboy heroics are redundant.
Now, what's notable about the Charlton heroes in their original pre-DC form is that they were mainly well known in their 1960s heyday as including some of the only explicitly politically themed characters in the genre at the time. Particularly in the cases of the Question and Blue Beetle, Ditko utilized his characters and story as direct, unapologetic mouthpieces for his deeply held commitment to the political philosophy of objectivism, a subset of right-wing conservatism founded by Atlas Shrugged author Ayn Rand that had long placed Ditko outside the mainstream of 60s comic book creators and a sizable amount of the teen and college audience that Marvel had begun to court in the same era and which Alan Moore is definitely on the far-flung other side of. Hence why Watchmen divides its ire between savaging the very idea of costume vigilantes as a force for justice and decency, while also specifically framing them as avatars of Nixonian, Thatcherite, and/or Reaganite authoritarianism and inflexible binary moral judgmentalism, and also why The Question, in Ditko's hands a crusading journalist who tells people the truth they don't want to hear and confounds his enemies with the power of his unbending sense of right and wrong, becomes Rorschach, a diminutive, filthy, mentally unstable, sexually stunted vagrant who nonetheless thinks he's better than everyone else, gets off on brutality, and also happens to be a vile, homophobic, misogynist bigot who hero worships the flag-waving rapist comedian and entrusts his life story to the Watchmen universe equivalent of Breitbart News.
All those liberals and intellectuals and smooth talkers.
Now, the absence of some of those finer details vis-a-vis Rorschach is not actually someone you're supposed to like. None of these assholes are, but especially not him.
The first Silk Spectre is a bloated, aging whore. This awful city, it screams like an abattoir full of retarded children. Even Adrian Veidt, possible homosexual.
Being either scrubbed or sanded down in Snyder's adaptation would suggest at least a little bit that either he didn't fully grasp that Rorschach isn't the badass good guy of the story and wanted to make him more palatable, or that he does grasp it but disagrees with Moore's take on the overall outlook and took it upon himself to offer an alternative vision. I don't know if I'm fully on board with either reading, but if you were looking for evidence to that effect, Snyder does seem to have a definite reoccurring affinity for heroes positioned as rugged, radical individualists standing up to both the weak and the antagonistic, plus he's been trying to get Warner Brothers to let him make a movie of Ayn Rand's The Fountainhead for the past few years between DC projects, and that happens to be a work that even more so than the better-known Atlas Shrugged fits rather comfortably with an outlook that would hold up.
What was I supposed to do? Just let him die?
Be their hero, Clark. Be their monument, be their angel. Be anything they need you to be.
Maybe.
Or be none of it. You don't owe this world a thing.
As moral wisdom and reasoned criticism of unilateral actions of the powerful by birthright turns out to be propaganda spread by nefarious enemies out of jealousy as a key plot point, so yeah, I guess that's a fair reading if you want to make it.